Welcome back to Inside Vietnam. I'm glad you're here, and I mean that because today's story is one I've been sitting on for a while, trying to figure out exactly how to introduce it. Most of the stories we tell on this channel have a recognizable shape. Man arrives, man meets woman, man ignores warnings, man loses money. You know the shape. You've probably already warned someone about the shape. But every now and then, we get a story that doesn't fit the template, and those are the ones that tell you something true. Wim van der Berg is 55 years old. He's Dutch, from Utrecht, the kind of solid, orderly Dutch city that produces solid, orderly men. For 28 years, he worked as a senior accountant for the municipal government. He is not a reckless man. He's not a lonely man, in the obvious sense. The kind you can spot at an airport bar at 2 in the morning. He's careful. He is methodical. Haughty, he did his research. He ran his numbers. And he still ended up sitting on a balcony and trying to figure out where the calculation had gone wrong. The title of this video asks a question a lot of you have probably wondered about. Why do Vietnamese women like foreign men? And I want to promise you something before we begin. We're going to answer that question properly today. Not the easy answer, not the cynical answer, the real one. And it's more complicated and more painful than most people want it to be. Wim is going to tell you his story in his own words. And I think when it's done, you're going to find yourself sitting with it for a while. This one's going to stick with you. Here's his story. I want to start by telling you what my life looked like, because I think it matters for understanding everything that came after. Not because it was a sad life. It was not a sad life. That is almost the whole point. I lived in an apartment near the Udegracht, the old canal in Utrecht. 2-bedroom, second floor, clean lines, good light in the morning. I had worked for the municipality for 28 years by the time any of this happened. Infrastructure budgets, capital expenditure reviews, annual reporting cycles. I was good at it. I was, if I am being honest, better at it. Better at it than at most other things. Numbers have a quality I find genuinely comforting. They do not change their position based on how they are feeling that day. A figure is a figure. You can rely on it. I had a pension, a proper one, the kind my generation was still offered, and which I am told younger people find slightly offensive to mention. I had savings, not extravagant, but sufficient. I had annual leave that I took in 2-week increments, usually somewhere in Europe, usually somewhere with good cycling infrastructure and reliable weather data. I cooked sensibly. I slept adequately. I maintained the apartment. Everything was in order. Sandra left in March, 2 years before any of this. We had been together 9 years. There was no dramatic event. No other person, no particular argument, nothing that gave me what I suppose I wanted, which was a specific error to correct. She sat down at the kitchen table one evening. It was a Tuesday. I remember this clearly, because I had just come back from the Wednesday that week. Fell on Tuesday grocery run, and she told me, quietly and without apparent cruelty, that she needed more than this. Then she wrote it on a piece of notepaper and left it on the table when she went to stay with her sister. I need more than this. I must have read that sentence 400 times. I kept thinking there was a footnote I was missing. Some additional clause that would specify what this was and what more would look like, and where exactly the shortfall appeared in the account. There was no footnote. Just those 5 words and a lot of white space beneath them. I want to be clear about something, because it matters for the story. I was not devastated in the way people perhaps imagine. I was not crying on the bathroom floor. I was, and I have thought about this carefully, confused. I had conducted myself correctly, as far as I could determine. I had been faithful, financially responsible, not unkind. The relationship had not been unhappy, at least not in any way I had been able to measure. And yet, the result was what it was. You can do everything correctly and still arrive at the wrong answer. I found this, professionally speaking, very difficult to accept. So I did what I do. I ran an audit. I made a spreadsheet. Yes, I am aware of how this sounds. Of activities recommended by various sources for improving emotional well-being following the end of a long-term relationship. Exercise, specifically gym membership. A new hobby. I found a cycling club. I attended twice. I tried a watercolor class that a colleague mentioned, which lasted 3 sessions before I concluded that watercolor is a medium that rewards a tolerance for ambiguity I apparently do not possess. I went to dinners with colleagues from the department. I ticked the items off the list. None of them moved the needle in any measurable direction. I was, as I say, not devastated. I was, as I say, not devastated. And I had been empty for 18 months before anything changed. The thing that changed was a retirement function for a man in my department named Peter. He had been in municipal planning for 30 years and was, not to put too fine a point on it, not someone I had particularly warm feelings about. But one attends these things. It is expected. So I attended, I had a glass of warm white wine, and I stood near the window watching Piete receive a framed commendation from the director. And that is when I heard someone near me say the word Danang. It was another colleague, Hank, recently returned from a visit to a friend who had retired there. He was showing photographs on his phone. They looked, I will admit, somewhat staged: white sand, blue water, a plate of something grilled and colorful. He was saying the cost of living was remarkable. The weather was reliable. A friend of his had been there 18 months and seemed, and this is the word he used, genuinely content. Hank seemed faintly surprised by this, as if contentment were a condition he associated with other countries, but not necessarily with men from Utrecht in their late 50s. I asked a few questions. Not many. It was a retirement function, not an investment meeting. But I listened. And on the way home, on the tram, I found myself doing something I had not done in quite some time. I was thinking about a possibility I had not previously considered. I was, in some small and unfamiliar way, curious. I want to be clear about this too, because honesty is the only reason I agreed to tell this story. I did not go to Vietnam looking for love. I had not been able to fix what was missing with cycling, or watercolor, or departmental dinners, and I genuinely thought, that the correct answer to the question might be found elsewhere. A different environment, new inputs, better data. I was looking for the correct answer to a question I had not been able to solve at home. That is all. That is how it started. The research took 6 weeks. I want to be precise about this because I think it tells you something about the kind of person I am and the kind of person I was dealing with when I eventually arrived. 6 weeks of evenings at my kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold beside the laptop, working through data the way I work. Through anything, methodically, cross-referencing sources, discounting the unreliable ones. I looked at Thailand first. The cost of living data was attractive, Chiang Mai especially. But when I read the expat forums, and you learn quickly to distinguish the people who are giving genuine information from the people who are processing unrelated grievances, I found a picture of infrastructure that I would describe as inconsistent. The healthcare in Bangkok was excellent. Outside Bangkok, it was considerably less excellent, and the gradient was steep. I noted this and moved on. Portugal was next. I noted this and moved on. Portugal was next. The numbers were reasonable, the climate was documented, the language barrier was manageable. But I sat with it for a few evenings, and I could not get past the feeling that Portugal would simply be Utrecht with better weather and a different type of loneliness. The same rhythm, the same demographic, the same quiet evenings, just warmer. I needed, and I am using this word carefully, recalibration. Portugal would not recalibrate anything. Vietnam had appeared in several of the more credible expat discussions as a genuine alternative for long-term stays. Not just the party tourism of Saigon's backpacker streets, but real life, people with routines, apartments, local friends, a sense of being somewhere rather than passing through. The cost of living indices were favorable. The healthcare quality scores for private facilities in the major cities were higher than I had expected. And there was one factor I noted in the forums that I will tell you honestly, because it becomes relevant later. Multiple contributors mentioned, not as a boast, but as a straightforward observation, that Vietnamese culture maintains genuine respect for older men. That age is not a problem there, that it is, in some contexts, an advantage. I noted this, filed it under relevant considerations, and I did not ask myself, at that point, why I was filing it there. I downloaded a Vietnamese language app. I used it for 11 days. The trial period expired, and I did not renew it, which I suppose tells you something about my level of commitment to integration versus my level of commitment to the idea of integration. I booked 3 weeks in high-end not Hanoi, which felt bureaucratic, not Saigon, which felt overwhelming from everything I had read. Jian was manageable, a small city, UNESCO old town, strong tourist infrastructure, strong reviews from the demographic I considered relevant, trial basis, option to extend if the metrics warranted it. I arrived at Da Nang International Airport on a Tuesday afternoon in October, and the heat was, there's no other word for it, physical, not warm, not hot in the European sense of a warm day, physical. It hit me coming through the terminal doors, and I stood there for a moment recalibrating, which is, I realized, exactly what I had wanted to do, and which I had not needed to do with anything in Utrecht for a long time. The taxi to Huion took 40 minutes along a coast road. The driver had the radio on, some Vietnamese pop song I did not recognize, tinny and cheerful. Out the window, the South China Sea to the right, flat and silver in the late afternoon. Scooters everywhere. I had read about the scooters. Reading about them and watching an uninterrupted river of Honda Waves and Vespas flowing in both directions on a 2-lane road, while a man on a motorbike carrying what appeared to be an entire refrigerator passed on the left, these are not the same experience. The guest house was near Trin Phu Street, in the Old Town. Small room, clean, a ceiling fan that worked, and an air conditioning unit that also worked, which I confirmed before unpacking. 800,000 dong per night, roughly 30 euros. I put my bag down and sat on the edge of the bed, and the smell came in through the window, which I had opened. And it was incense, and something frying, and the faint diesel of the scooters. And underneath it all, something I cannot name precisely. Some base note of heat and vegetation that does not exist in the Netherlands. I sat with it for a moment. I established a routine within 2 days, because this is what I do. Breakfast at a small cafe on Phan Chu Trin Street, where they made ka fa swaha, iced coffee with condensed milk, very sweet, which I ordered twice before deciding I enjoyed it, and a banh ma from the cart outside that cost 15,000 dong and was, by any reasonable measure, excellent. A morning walk along the Thu Ban River, while it was still manageable temperature. Afternoon in the guest house, or at a table outside somewhere reading, which I had not done properly in about 3 years. Dinner at places I had bookmarked, working through them systematically. Days 1 through 8 were, I would say, adequately pleasant. The food was better than I had expected. The cost was lower than the data had suggested. The people were not unfriendly. I had 1 or 2 brief conversations with other tourists, a German couple, a pair of young Australians who were traveling before starting work and seemed to find the entire world remarkable, which I found both charming and faintly exhausting. I did not make friends. I was not there to make friends. I was conducting an evaluation. Day 9, I needed 2 linen shirts. This was practical. The clothes I had packed were wrong for the heat, a miscalculation in my preparation, and linen was the correct material for the climate. I had noted during my walks that Xi'an's tailoring industry was substantial, and that several shops on Trin Phu had consistently good reviews for quality and turnaround time. I had shortlisted 3. I went to the one with the most reliable recent reviews and a quoted turnaround of 48 hours. I had calculated, from the reviews, that 2 linen shirts should cost between 600,000 and 900,000 dong each, roughly 22 to 33 euros. Reasonable. Within parameters. I had a specific idea of the collar I wanted. I had mentally prepared a brief, clear explanation of what I needed, so as not to waste anyone's time. I walked in. The shop smelled of fabric, and something floral. A diffuser somewhere near the back. Bolts of cloth on shelves along both walls. Samples hanging. Natural light from the street. A woman behind the front counter looked up from whatever she had been doing and said, in careful, correct English, "Good morning. What can I help you with today?" And I paused, not for any dramatic reason. I simply noticed, in the way you notice a figure that doesn't match your projection, that I had not been looked at like that in some time, not in any particular way, just attentively, as if my answer was going to be interesting. As if my answer was going to be interesting. She looked up. That is all. I know how inadequate that sounds, but that is where it started, and I want to be honest about the size of the thing that started it. It was not a grand moment. It was a woman behind a counter in a tailor's shop on Trun Fu Street, looking up from her work. Her name was Lin. She was 31 years old, though I did not learn this immediately. I learned it the way I learned everything about her, gradually, in conversation, over Kei Fu Shua at a plastic table outside a place near the Heian market, with the sound of motorbikes going past, and a vendor somewhere down the street calling out something I never understood. But I am getting ahead of myself. She took my measurements, a collar detail, a sleeve length, a preference for a particular weight of linen she confirmed they had in stock, and she asked where I was from. Utrecht, I said. She asked if that was near Amsterdam. Closer to the middle, I said. She nodded as if this was useful information and made a small note. Then she asked, with what I now recognize was genuine curiosity and not performance, what I did for work. Accountant, I said. Municipal government. She considered this for a moment. Then she said that numbers must be a kind of language, that you could say true things in numbers that were difficult to say in words. I want to be honest about my reaction to that remark. It is possible it was an excellent opening line. It is also possible it was a genuinely perceptive observation from a 31-year-old woman who had been dealing with European tourists long enough to know that asking thoughtful questions is more effective than asking obvious ones. I have never fully resolved which interpretation is correct. What I can tell you is that no one had said anything to me in approximately 2 years that made me want to think about the answer. And that sentence did. I said the shirts would be ready in 48 hours. She said yes, Thursday afternoon. I paid the deposit, 350,000 dong, about 13 euros, and left. I came back on day 11 to collect them. She was there. The shirts were excellent, by the way. Precisely as specified. But I stayed for 20 minutes talking, which was not required for the transaction and which I did not plan. I am noting this because I was, at that point, still telling myself that I was operating within parameters. The extra 20 minutes was the first parameter I exceeded without logging the exception. I asked her, at the end of those 20 minutes, if she would like to have coffee. I framed this as wanting a local recommendation. I said I had been drinking alone at tourist places and would benefit from local knowledge. She found this amusing. She named a cafe near the market for the following afternoon and said she finished work at 4:30. I want to be transparent with you. It was not about local knowledge. She knew that, and I knew that. We simply both allowed the framing to stand, which I now understand is its own kind of communication. The next 10 days, I extended my stay by 10 days, which I will come to, were the best I had spent in approximately 2 years. Probably longer, if I am being rigorous. We had coffee twice. Dinner once at a Bon Bo Hua, place near the covered market where the broth was deeply orange and tasted of lemongrass and something I could not identify, and she ate it with the ease of someone for whom this was ordinary, and I ate it badly with a spoon before she showed me how to use the chopsticks more efficiently. We took a long walk one evening through the old town when the lanterns were lit and the Thubai River was dark, and the air smelled of incense from the temples and frangipani from somewhere, and I bought a small painted wooden boat from a vendor near the Japanese covered bridge because she said her younger sister collected them, and I thought, well, I was not thinking clearly. She told me about her family. Her parents lived in a village in Nam province, about 20 minutes outside the old town on a motorbike. Her father grew vegetables. Her mother ran the household with what Lin described, with obvious affection, as an iron hand in a velvet glove. 3 siblings, a sister studying nursing in Da Nang, a brother who was 19, and a younger sister who was still in school. Lin was the eldest. She had been working at the tailor's shop, not her family's business. She was employed by the owner, a woman named Ba Hun Hung, who had run the shop for 20 years, for 3 years. I registered all of this. I noted it the way I note context in a report. I did not at any point consider that the context was also a structure. That is the thing I think about now. What was different about Lin, genuinely different, not what I wanted to be different, was that she never steered the conversation toward money. Not once. She never asked what I earned, what my savings were, whether I owned property. She asked about my work in terms of what the work was like, what a municipal budget looked like, how errors were found, whether I found it satisfying. These were not questions anyone had asked me about my work with any real interest in some time. Sandra had been polite about it. Colleagues discussed it instrumentally. Lynn asked as if the answer was going to tell her something she wanted to know about me specifically. She never asked me for anything directly. I need you to understand what I mean when I say that was the problem. I had spent 2 years with no one needing anything from me in any personal sense. The absence of a request felt like a gift. I had been so surrounded, in that long, quiet stretch after Sandra, by my own adequate sufficiency, everything in order, nothing required, that someone simply wanting to know how I thought about my work felt. And I am aware of how this will sound, like being seen. I extended my stay by 10 days. I told myself I had not fully evaluated the region. I am telling you now that this was not true, and I knew it was not true when I said it, and that this is the first moment in the story where I stopped being a man conducting an evaluation and started being something else. I noted the exception in my tracking document and did not examine it further. At work, I would never have permitted that. An unexplained exception is precisely the thing you examine. By the last day of the extended stay, we had spent perhaps 12 hours together in total. Coffee, 1 dinner, 2 walks, a visit to my son that I suggested, and she agreed to on the basis that, she said, she had grown up 20 minutes away and never gone because it was priced for tourists. I paid the entry. About 250,000 dong each, €9. She looked at the Cham ruins with the expression of someone who was genuinely surprised to be there. Total expenditure over the extended stay, personal, approximately €800. Dinners, coffees, the entry fee, the small gifts. I had it logged, within parameters for a supplementary 10-day stay. Negligible relative to my savings. I was certain of this at the time. I am less certain now that the certainty itself was the problem. The last morning, she came to the guest house to say goodbye. She brought a small paper bag of bonhinjuzon, mung bean sweets from her mother's village, she said, a local speciality. Her mother made them herself. Small pale yellow squares, very sweet, slightly crumbly. She gave them to me without ceremony, the way you give someone something practical for a journey. I carried them home to Utrecht in my carry-on bag so they would not be crushed. They are still on my kitchen shelf. I have not moved them. I notice this every morning when I make coffee, and I have not yet decided what it means, or whether it means anything, or whether the fact that I have not moved them is itself a kind of answer to a question I am not quite ready to ask. Utrecht in November is a particular kind of gray. Not dramatic gray, not the gray of a storm that at least has the decency to be interesting. Just, consistent, uniform. The canal was exactly where I had left it. The apartment was exactly as I had left it. I put my bag down, opened the window briefly, closed it again because it was cold, and stood in the kitchen for a moment looking at the shelf where the Bon He Yuzan was sitting. I went back to work the next morning. The capital expenditure review for the following fiscal year was on my desk. I sat down and worked through it. The numbers were, as usual, reliable. Lynn and I had exchanged numbers before I left. She used Zalo, which is the application most Vietnamese use for messaging, and I downloaded it on the taxi to Da Nang Airport. She sent me a message that evening, a photograph of the street outside the tailor's shop at dusk, the lanterns coming on. I looked at it for quite a long time before I replied. We communicated every day after that. Not extensively. She worked long hours at the shop, and I was not the kind of person who sends lengthy messages, but daily, consistently, in the way you establish a routine. She sent photographs. The Thu Bon River on a foggy morning, a bowl of kaolu from a place near the market, occasionally a brief video of something on the street outside the shop that she found amusing. I sent her photographs of Utrecht. I looked at them before sending and found them. I used the word beige to her, actually. She asked what beige meant. I explained. She sent back a photograph of a gray Dutch sky she had found somewhere online with the caption, "This one, also beige." I found this, unexpectedly, very funny. I booked the return flight within 3 weeks of landing. I want to note that I did not make a spreadsheet about this decision. I am noting it because the absence of a spreadsheet was, for me, genuinely significant. Every previous discretionary expenditure of more than 500 euros in my adult life had been preceded by some form of documented analysis, a comparison, a projection, a column for risk. I booked the flight the way, I imagine, other people book flights, quickly, on a Tuesday evening, before I had fully considered what I was deciding. Second trip, 1 month this time. I booked an apartment rental rather than a guest house. A small place off Nguyen Thi Minh Sai Street in the Old Town. 10 million dong for the month, roughly 370 euros, more sensible for a longer stay. I told my department head I was taking extended annual leave to travel. This was accurate. Lint met me at the apartment door. She had offered to help me find the place, since addresses in Hin Sim system are not entirely intuitive for visitors. She was standing outside when my grab car pulled up, and she was. I'm going to describe this factually rather than sentimentally, simply pleased to see me, not performed pleasure. Just the expression of someone for whom your arrival is a good thing. I had not been anyone's good thing in some time. We had 10 days of simply being in Hoi An together before the family visit. Mornings at the cafe on Phan Shu Trin, long evenings at a Quan Na Hon, near the river, where we ate grilled pork and morning glory fried in garlic and drank 333 beer from bottles that sweated in the heat. She showed me the parts of the town she actually used, rather than the parts tourists used, which were different in ways that were difficult to articulate but immediately obvious, narrower, cheaper, more interesting. I met Ba Hong, the owner of the tailor's shop, briefly, a small woman in her 60s, who looked at me with the polite skepticism of someone who had seen many foreign men come through Hoi An and was making no preliminary conclusions. On day 10, Lin asked if I would like to meet her family. She framed it carefully. No pressure was her exact phrase, and she seemed to mean it, or seemed to mean that the pressure was not from her. She said only that her parents would be glad to meet someone important to her if I was comfortable. I said yes. I understood, I told the camera afterwards, that this was a significant step in Vietnamese culture. I had, in fact, read about it. The house was about 20 minutes from the old town on a rented motorbike, down a provincial road that ran between rice fields and vegetable plots. The kind of road where chickens occasionally required route adjustment. Concrete home, single story, painted pale yellow. A small vegetable garden to one side. Near the entrance, a family altar with incense burning and a photograph of an older man, a grandparent, I assumed, and a small arrangement of fruit in front of it. Her mother was waiting at the door. Formal, upright, a woman of perhaps 60, who assessed me with the thoroughness of someone reviewing a substantial application. She had prepared food, a full meal, bunless tong and spring rolls, and a soup. I could not identify that was very good, and the table had been set in a way that was very good, and the table had been set in a way that indicated preparation. Her father was there, seated already. He stood when I came in, slowly. He moved carefully, I noticed. He mentioned his back in passing, the way people mention something chronic and familiar. The brother, Kai, was 19 and largely silent. The older sister was in Da Nang at her nursing program. The younger sister, Nguyen, was 17 and did her homework at the end of the table throughout dinner with the focused disengagement of a teenager who has been asked to be present but is not required to perform. The atmosphere was warm. It was also unmistakably structured. I was being assessed. I was aware of this and I found it genuinely appropriate. In the Netherlands, we are perhaps less formal about these things, or formal in different ways. This felt honest. Her mother wanted to know who I was. That seemed reasonable. At one point during dinner, her mother asked me something in Vietnamese and Lin translated. She asked what kind of work I did. I explained. Municipal accounting, infrastructure budgets, 28 years. Her mother nodded and asked Lin something else, which Lin translated as, "Is it stable work?" I said yes, very stable, and that I was now fully pensioned. Her mother nodded again. I think about that nod now. At the time, I read it as approval. I understand now it was also something else, a figure being entered into a column. On the drive back that evening, Lin was quiet for a while. Then she said, in the careful way she said things that were not quite requests, her father's back had been difficult for some time. The specialist in Da Nang was expensive. The public hospital was less good. She said it the way you say something is a shame. Not with expectation. With the practiced indirectness of someone who has learned that direct requests make the other person uncomfortable. I want to be precise about something, and I need you to hear this correctly. She did not manipulate me about her father's back. Her father's back genuinely hurt. I want that on the record, because the story only makes sense if you understand that the first payment was correct. 12 million dong, roughly 450 euros, for a specialist consultation, I offered. She thanked me. The appointment was arranged for the following week. It was the correct thing for a decent person to do. I have sat with this for a long time. The correctness of that first step is not the lesson. The lesson is that a correct first step and a sound subsequent trajectory are not the same thing, and I did not, at that point, look at the trajectory. On the last evening of the month, over dinner at the kitchen table in my rented apartment, Lynn mentioned, almost in passing, as a shared observation rather than a request, that her mother had said the roof of the family home was beginning to cause problems. Certain sections. She wasn't sure what the repair would involve. I made a mental note. I did not yet act on it. Total spend by end of the second trip. Approximately 4,500 euros, including accommodation, the father's specialist fee, and a month of ordinary living costs. I updated my tracking document on the flight home. It remained within what I considered manageable parameters. I had a pension and 90,000 euros in savings. 4,500 euros was 5%. I had evaluated larger variances without concern. But I want to ask you something. If you have professional experience with financial analysis, when you see a trend, do you evaluate the individual data point or the direction of the line? I know the answer. I've always known the answer. I simply chose, on that particular flight, to look at the point. The third trip was 3 months. I want to be honest about what that meant. It was not a holiday. I had applied, through a visa agency in Utrecht that a foreign contributor had recommended as credible, for a multiple entry e-visa that would allow me 90 days. The process was straightforward for Dutch nationals. I filed the application in January and flew back to Hainan in February. I had told no one at the department that I was considering not returning. This was perhaps the most significant thing I was not saying during this period. I had begun, quietly, to model what a permanent relocation would look like. Cost of living in Hainan versus Utrecht. Healthcare options for a man of 55 at the private facilities in Da Nang. What a comfortable monthly budget required, balanced against my pension income. The pension was approximately 2,100 euros per month combined, the civil service component plus the state AOW contribution that would begin at 67. The savings were still approximately 85,000 euros. I had a spreadsheet for this. I want to be clear, I was making a spreadsheet again. This should have reassured me. It did not occur to me that the thing I was now justifying in columns was the decision I had already made. I moved into a larger apartment this time, near Si Chem Pho Ward, 12 million dong per month, about 440 euros. Reasonable for the size, close to the old town. A balcony facing north, where the mornings were cool enough to drink coffee outside without the heat becoming immediate. I had, in a small way, begun to live there rather than visit. The motorbike came up in the third week. Lynn mentioned it over dinner at a Khemga place on Phan Bi Sha 2 Street. The kind of place where the rice is cooked in chicken broth and served with shredded ginger, and it cost perhaps 60,000 dong for a full plate. She said Kai had been looking at work opportunities, delivery, some light logistics. She was not specific, but that without reliable transport, it was difficult to be considered. She said this not as a request, as a problem. The same careful register she used for everything that was not quite a request, but was waiting to become one if I engaged with it. 15 million dong. About 600 euros for a reasonable used Honda. I said I would transfer the money. She thanked me. She received the motorbike. I want to note something about Kai. In the months I had been coming to the family home, I had not observed any evidence of employment. He had a new phone, not extravagant, a mid-range device, but newer than you would expect from a 19-year-old in a provincial household with a father who could not work full days. When I mentioned this to myself, internally, as a note, the way you flag an anomaly, I filed it under youth unemployment rates in rural Quang Nam, which are documented and real. I did not follow up on the job prospects. At work, I would have followed up on the job prospects. I had a habit, professionally, of checking whether the budget lines I approved were producing the outcomes they were approved for. I applied this habit to infrastructure expenditures for 28 years. I did not apply it here. The roof was the larger item. Lynn's mother had, apparently, been gathering quotes for some months. She presented 2 of them, printed, folded, at a family dinner in the 4th week of my 3rd stay, passed to Lynn, who passed them to me. I looked at them with the translation app on my phone. The structural work was genuine. 2 sections of the roof showed deterioration, one with active water ingress, the previous rainy season. The cosmetic repairs were additional, 2 quotes, 78 million and 84 million dong respectively. The lower quote was from a local builder the family knew. I told Lynn I wanted to review the itemization against the scope of work. She looked at me for a moment and then nodded and asked her mother, who explained each line through Lynn while I cross-referenced with the translation app. The quotes were reasonable. I found them reasonable because they were reasonable. 80 million dong, approximately 3,200 euros. I agreed to pay half immediately and the remainder upon completion of the structural work. The cosmetic sections could wait for a future decision. The roof was repaired over 2 weeks in March. I saw it in progress on 2 of my visits: cement mixers, 3 workers, the smell of dust, and something adhesive in the heat. When it was finished, Lynn's mother made a meal specifically for me. She set a place at the head of the table, which was not where I had sat before. She said something to Lynn during the meal, quietly, and Lynn translated it as, "The house is protected now because of you." I am not certain that is a precise translation, but that is what she said. I noticed that the family treated me differently after the roof. Not more warmly exactly, they had always been warm, more inclusively, as though a probationary classification had been updated to something more permanent. Conchi acknowledged me when I arrived rather than nodding from his phone. Her father asked me, through Lynn, about the Netherlands, specifically whether it was true that the Dutch had built much of their country on reclaimed land. We had a conversation about hydraulic engineering that I found genuinely enjoyable. I noted that this felt good. I am telling you now that I am embarrassed. It felt good, not because the feeling was wrong, but because I was treating approval as evidence of something it was not necessarily evidence of. I should pause here, because there is something you need to understand about Vietnamese property law before the next part of this story makes sense. As a foreign national in Vietnam, I could not own land. I could own an apartment, a leasehold, maximum 50 years, with certain restrictions that vary by location. Any structure built on land classified as agricultural or residential and held under a Vietnamese family's land use certificate, what they call the Sul. This is not a loophole or an ambiguity. It is simply the law. I knew this. I had researched it. I am telling you this because what happens next is not a story about a man who did not know. It is a story about a man who knew and proceeded anyway, which is a different story and in some ways a more difficult one to explain. Lynn raised the homestay over dinner one evening in the 5th week, not as a business pitch, as a thought she had been having. Her family owned a plot of agricultural land at the edge of the village, about 1/3 of a hectare, mostly unused except for a small section her father had grown vegetables on before his back made that impractical. Tourism in the region was growing. She had been looking at what small boutique homestays in the Hue An area were earning, occupancy rates, nightly prices, the kinds of reviews that made one property preferable over another. She showed me the figures on her phone. 2 or 3 bungalows, a small open garden structure, emphasis on local materials. The kind of aesthetic that photographed well for international booking platforms. I checked her arithmetic. It was correct. I remember thinking, she did her homework. That impressed me. I should have been asking different questions. I should have been asking whose name the land was in, what a contractual investment arrangement between a foreign national and a Vietnamese family actually looked like in practice, what mechanism existed for recovering my contribution if the relationship ended. I should have been asking all of this the way I would ask it for any investment of 35,000 euros, which was the figure we had begun to discuss. I said I needed to think. I flew back to Utrecht for 10 days to review the numbers independently, which I did, and which is how I can tell you. The arithmetic was sound and the market projections were not unreasonable. I was composing the investment rationale in my head on the return flight. The decision was already made. I was simply still calling it a deliberation. I came back earlier than planned, a week earlier actually. A connecting flight had become available that was cheaper than my booked fare, and I rescheduled. I thought it would be a pleasant surprise. I rode a rented motorbike out to the family land on a Tuesday afternoon without telling anyone I was coming. I wanted to see the plot properly, take some measurements, think about orientation and drainage. Practical preparation. There was already a foundation. Poured concrete, roughly marked out, maybe 10 by 12 meters, and at one end, the beginning of a wall, perhaps 40 centimeters of block laid, with rebar rising from it at intervals. No builder present that afternoon. No tools. Just the structure, sitting there in the afternoon heat, with no invoice submitted and no conversation had. I stood and looked at it for a while. The concrete was recent. A week old, perhaps 2. Someone had started something, with someone's money, and I had not been told. I raised it with Lynn that evening. I did not raise it as an accusation. I raised it the way I raise anomalies at work, as a query that requires resolution before I can close the line item. I asked who had funded the preliminary work and why I had not been informed, she explained. Her mother had found a local builder who offered a favorable rate for the foundation pour and had not wanted to let the offer pass. It was preliminary work only, positioning, orientation, load-bearing requirements. They had been waiting for my confirmation before proceeding further. The explanation was warm, patient, utterly logical. I believed her. I want to be honest about that. I believed her, and I don't think she was entirely lying. But I think about that afternoon often, standing on the edge of a half-built foundation on land I could not legally own, with a woman I cared about whose family's welfare I had become structurally responsible for, and 35,000 euros worth of commitment already taking shape in concrete before I had signed anything or seen a single piece of documentation. I did not ask to see documentation that evening. I am an accountant. I audit things for a living. I did not ask to see a piece of paper. I accepted the explanation and stayed for dinner. I want to describe the afternoon carefully, because the details matter, and because I have gone over them many times. It was a Wednesday, late in the 7th month of my involvement with Lynn's family. I had been coming to the house 2 or 3 times per week by this point, for dinner, sometimes for an afternoon, occasionally just to sit on the low concrete steps at the front with a coffee from a thermos. Her mother always had ready, watching the vegetable garden and the road and the occasional motorbike passing. I had become, in the specific way that proximity produces its own kind of belonging, a fixture, not family, but something adjacent to it, something that had a place at the table and a preferred cup and a chair that was understood to be mine when I was present. That afternoon, Lynn and her mother were in the kitchen. I could hear them talking, the particular rhythm of Vietnamese spoken between a mother and adult daughter, fast and domestic, with occasional laughter, the smell of something with lemongrass and fish sauce coming through the door. I was at the kitchen table with my coffee and my phone, reading something about tourism development in central Vietnam that I had found relevant to the homestay planning. The discussions about the investment figure were ongoing. 35,000 euros had been named. Nothing had been transferred. I kept telling myself I was still in the deliberation phase, which was becoming less convincing as each week passed. Nong Guan was at the end of the table with her schoolbooks. She was 17 and quiet in the way of a teenager who is paying more attention to everything around her than she appears to be. Her English was better than she usually displayed. I had noticed this gradually. The way she would sometimes track an English conversation a half-second before Lynn translated it. We had developed a comfortable, easy way with each other. She asked me things she wouldn't ask in front of the full family. I helped her sometimes with homework. That afternoon, she was working on geography, and she asked me something about the borders of the Netherlands, whether it was true that Belgium had once been part of the same country. I told her yes, briefly, in the early 19th century. She wrote something in her notebook. We talked for a few minutes about European history in the comfortable way of 2 people who were both slightly bored and find each other's company adequate to the afternoon. And then, without any particular shift in tone, not a confession, not a warning, simply a conversational statement, the way you state something you assume everyone already knows, she said. My mother says, if you marry Lynn, all of us will be okay. I want to describe what happened in my body when she said it, but I am not certain I can do it accurately. There was no dramatic physical response. I did not put down my cup with a sudden movement. I asked Angden one more question about her homework. I asked if she had found the right map in the textbook. She said yes and showed me the page. I said good. I finished my coffee. I said I had an appointment I had forgotten, which was untrue. I thanked her mother through the kitchen doorway for the coffee. I got on my rented scooter and rode back through the village and down the provincial road toward the old town with the afternoon heat coming off the asphalt and a karaoke machine running somewhere behind a wall of banana plants. And I drove for 40 minutes until I was sitting on my apartment balcony looking at the Thu Bien River going gray in the early evening. I sat there for approximately 2 hours. I did not call Lynn. I did not open my laptop. I just sat there. Before I tell you what happened in my laptop, I just sat there. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to say something about what Ngeen's mother was expressing when she said that. Because I have thought about this carefully, and I think it is important to be honest about the complexity of it, rather than simply casting it as the moment the curtain was pulled back on a scheme. In Vietnamese families, and this is not a generalization, this is a structural reality, the eldest daughter carries a weight that has no real equivalent in the Netherlands. She is not merely a child who is loved. She is a responsibility bearer. The eldest daughter is expected, culturally and practically, and in ways that go back generations, to support her parents, to stabilize the family, to ensure that the people around her are okay. This is called filial piety, and it is not a performance. It is a genuine moral framework. Lynn was 31, the eldest of 4, with a father who could not work, and a family whose financial circumstances were genuinely precarious. Her mother was not necessarily saying, use this man. She may simply have been saying what was true, that if Lynn married someone stable, the family situation would improve. These are not the same thing as deception. Sometimes they are not even incompatible with love. I am telling you this because the story only makes sense if you understand that what I discovered that afternoon was not necessarily a lie. It may have been the plainest truth anyone in that household had spoken. I sat with the sentence for 3 days. I ran it through every possible interpretation, the way I run a discrepancy through scenarios, testing each one, looking for an alternative that made everything balance. Perhaps Ngeen had misquoted. Perhaps okay was a translation that softened something more emotionally complex. Perhaps her mother was expressing hope for Lynn's happiness, and the family security was incidental rather than primary. I gave each interpretation equal consideration and equal time. None of them resolved the entry. None of them made the sentence into something I could close. On the 3rd day, I messaged Lynn and asked if she would meet me at the cafe near the market. Our cafe, the first one. I said I wanted to talk. She said, of course, what time? I had prepared what I wanted to ask. I am an accountant. I do not go into a conversation that matters without knowing what I need to establish. I was not angry. Anger would have been easier in some ways. I was simply a man who had an unresolved entry and needed a direct question answered before he could proceed. She was there when I arrived. Kaye Fi Sada already ordered, the way she always did when she arrived first. The cafe was loud with lunchtime traffic from the road outside, the ceiling fans turning slowly, the smell of coffee and something fried from the kitchen, the ordinary details of a place that had been, for me, associated with good things. I asked her, is this about me, or is it about what I represent to your family? She was quiet for a long time, not the silence of someone formulating a lie, the silence of someone who has been asked a question they thought they would not be asked, and who is now deciding whether to answer it honestly. Then she cried. And then she said, with a simplicity I found, and I still find, very difficult to place as either manipulation or sincerity. She said that both things were true. She cared for me. She also could not separate herself from her family's situation. She thought I had understood this. She thought this was something we were building together, for everyone. She seemed genuinely confused by the distinction I was drawing between the two. I sat with that. Both things are true. I've repeated that to myself many times since. It is either the most honest thing anyone said to me in that relationship, or the most devastating, or possibly both, in the same way that Negan's sentence was possibly both a plan and simply the truth. I asked her one more question. I asked whether, if I had been a kind Dutchman without savings and a pension, she would have introduced me to her mother after 10 days. She did not answer. I did not push. I already had the answer. I went back to the apartment. I opened my banking application and transferred 4,000 euros to her account, the remaining balance owed on the roof, the portion I had agreed to pay upon completion of the structural work. I owed that money. I paid it. I wrote no note with the transfer. Then I booked a flight to Amsterdam Schiphol for 4 days later. In those 4 days, I did not see Lynn. She messaged me. The messages were warm and sad and somewhat confused, which I understood because the situation was genuinely confusing. She sent one message that said, "I thought you were different from the others." I read that message many times. I thought so too. The flight from Da Nang to Amsterdam Schiphol takes approximately 11 hours with a connection in Kuala Lumpur. I know this precisely because I took it 4 times. I opened my tracking document somewhere over the South China Sea, in the dark, with the cabin quiet around me and a small cup of tea going cold on the tray table. I went through every entry from the beginning, the first flights, the guest houses and apartments, the dinners and coffees and the entry fee at Mia Sin, the father's specialist consultation, the motorbike, the roof, first half and second half, the various living costs across 3 extended stays, the final 4,000 euros transferred without a note 4 days ago. The total was 16,500 euros. I had it to the nearest 50. I want to be precise about what that number means. My savings at the time of first departure had been approximately 90,000 euros. 16,500 euros represents roughly 18% of that figure. My pension income, the civil service component, continues monthly regardless. The savings account is reduced but functional. I was not ruined. I want to say that plainly, because I have no interest in false drama, and the expat internet has enough of it. By the standard of cautionary tales, I escaped relatively lightly. But I opened a second column. I do not know why I did this on the flight. It was not something I had planned. I just opened a second column, and I began to write, not figures, but what the figures were for. What 16,500 euros had been intended to purchase. And I want to read you what I wrote, because I think it is the most honest accounting I have done in my professional life. The money was for warmth, for the specific sensation of being in a room where your arrival causes something to improve, for the experience of being someone's good thing, which I had not been for 2 years before the first flight, in which I was, I believe genuinely, for Lynn, at least for some portion of the time we were together. The money was for purpose. For the feeling that the next column, the one I had been calling column B since Sandra left, the column for what a life is worth, was finally filling in with something real. Column A and column B. They did not balance on that flight. They have not balanced since. I landed at Schiphol on a gray Tuesday morning and took the train to Utrecht and walked from the station to the apartment. The canal was where I had left it. The apartment was exactly as I had left it. The Banhei Yuzan bag from Lynn's mother was on the kitchen shelf, small and pale yellow, exactly where I had put it 8 months earlier. I did not move it. I made coffee, and I stood in the kitchen, and I looked at the bag, and then I went to work. My colleagues asked how the traveling had been. I said it had been interesting. This was accurate. No one asked further questions. I sat at my desk and opened the capital expenditure review for the new fiscal year, and I worked through it. The numbers were, as they have always been, reliable. The weeks after that were, I will describe them as a particular kind of stillness, not depression. I have thought about this carefully, and I do not believe it was depression. It was more like the quiet at the end of an audit cycle, when everything has been reviewed and the figures are filed and there is nothing left to examine. I was nothing left to examine. I was nothing left to examine. I want to be clear about that because it would be easy to say it, and it would not be true. What I was broken by, and I'm using that word carefully because I believe it is the correct one, was a realization that arrived somewhere over the South China Sea at around 3 in the morning, and which I have been working through since. I was broken before I got on the first plane. Sandra had left because I was giving careful, measured, organized portions of myself, and she needed more than this. I went to Vietnam and gave careful, measured, organized portions of myself plus approximately 16,000 euros, and arrived at the same conclusion. The line item I had forgotten to include in every analysis I had ever run on my own life was this. The thing Sandra was asking for, and the thing Lynn was not able to give me separate from what I represented to her family, were probably the same thing. And it is a thing I am genuinely uncertain I know how to produce. I want to say something about Lynn before I finish. I have been asked several times in the process of telling this story whether I think she was using me, and I have thought about this question with the same care I give to any question that has a significant answer. I do not believe she was predatory. I do not believe the relationship was constructed. I believe she was a 31-year-old woman with genuine feelings and impossible obligations, and a family whose welfare she carried the way the eldest daughter in a Vietnamese family carries such things, not as a calculation, but as a fact of her existence. And I believe that I was a useful solution to a problem that predated me, and that she had never fully separated those two things in her own mind, and that she may not have known she needed to. I do not hate her. I find this, if I am honest, harder than hating her would have been. I have 3 things I would say to someone sitting where I was sitting, 18 months after Sandra, looking at a photograph of white sand and blue water on a colleague's phone at a retirement function. First, the absence of direct demands is not the absence of expectation. Learn to read the structure, not just the surface. I spent 28 years reading between the lines of budget reports. I did not apply that skill here. Second, evaluate the pattern, not the individual transaction. Any single payment was justifiable. The trajectory was not. If you would flag the trend at work, flag it in your personal life. The methodology does not change because the subject matter is more pleasant. Third, and this is the one that costs the most to say, know what you are actually looking for before you go. Because if you do not know, Vietnam or anywhere will provide an answer. And it will be the answer to the question you are actually asking, not the one you think you are. I was looking for evidence that I was worth loving, and I found someone who provided it, and I did not ask hard enough questions about the terms. He closes the notebook he has been holding throughout this conversation. He does not say goodbye. He simply stops speaking and looks at the table for a moment, and then at the camera, and then somewhere past it. That was Wim van den Berg, 55 years old. Utrecht, Netherlands. 28 years of making sure other people's numbers added up. I want to come back to the question in the title, because it deserves a direct answer, and Wim's story earns one. Why do Vietnamese women like foreign men? The honest answer is, for the same reasons people form attachments everywhere, and also for reasons that are specific to Vietnam in 2024, in the way that real poverty and real family obligation and real social pressure create real incentives that don't have clean equivalents in the Netherlands or anywhere else in the wealthy West. A foreign man, particularly an older one with a pension and savings and stability, represents something structural. He represents a solution to problems that are genuinely pressing, that can coexist with genuine affection. Often it does. Most of the time, if you look at these relationships honestly, it is both. And the man who cannot hold both things true simultaneously, who needs it to be purely love or purely exploitation, is the one most likely to get hurt. Wim was not a foolish man. He was not desperate in any obvious sense. He made no reckless decisions. He ignored no warnings because he received no warnings. He received reasonable explanations for everything and found them because they were reasonable. He lost 16,000 euros and another year of the one life he has, and he flew 9,000 kilometers to discover something he might have found cheaper and closer to home, which is that a man who has spent his entire adult life being adequate cannot fix the problem by relocating it. That is not a story about Vietnam. That is a story about loneliness. And loneliness, if you look at the channel archives, is the engine behind most of the stories we tell here. Not greed, not stupidity, just the ordinary human need to be someone's good thing, dressed up in different currencies and different cities. If you are in this situation or heading toward one, there is no shame in it. There is only the question of what you do next. Know what you are actually looking for. Evaluate the pattern, not the transaction. And understand that cultural obligation is real. It is not always manipulation, and the people who live inside it are not always villains. Ask the hard questions early, before the foundation is poured. That is what Inside Vietnam is here for. Subscribe if this reached you. Share it if it might reach someone else who needs it. There is a link in the description with more resources on navigating expat life in Vietnam. Responsibly, the legal realities, the financial realities, and the human ones. We will see you in the next story. Take care of yourselves out there.